welcome you to this Wednesday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to tell you what I read this week in my daily Bible reading. It sort of met me right where I was, and I hope this devotion tonight will meet you right where you are. The title of the message is Fill the Valley with Trenches. What in the world does that mean? Well, that was an instruction that God gave to the people in the Old Testament during the time of Elisha the prophet. And I want to share that message with you. It's the story of people in desperate need. It's the story of the Lord's ability to meet that need. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. And as we look at it, it really looks like a page out of ancient history. But you will find this story is as current as the evening news. It is the story of one kingdom that was sanctioned. We've heard about sanctions in the news. Well, they did that in the Old Testament. One kingdom was sanctioned by another kingdom. And then that kingdom that had been sanctioned rebelled against those sanctions. And that rebellion was seen as an act of war. The king of Israel had imposed those sanctions on the kingdom of Moab. Now, while he was the king of Israel, I have to let you know that he was of no use to God. He had no connection to God. The only good that the Bible has to say about him is that he was not as wicked as his father, but he was still a wicked man. And we're talking about the king of Israel. He was wicked. His father before him was wicked, as his father was before him. This king's name was Jehoram, and he was the grandson of Ahab and Jezebel. And you might know they were the most wicked couple in all the Bible. So here we put it into context. It's a Bible story. This historical context helps us to understand what was happening. Ahab is the one who originally put the sanctions on the king of Moab. And now we come to verse 4 of 2 Kings chapter 3. Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder and used to pay the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. And King Jehoram went out of Samaria at that time and mustered all Israel. Then he went and sent word to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, "The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab?" And he said, "I will go up. I am as you are, and my people as your people, my horses as your horses." And he said, "Which way will we go up?" And he said, "By the wilderness of Edom." Now, this is a story about sanctions and a rebellion against those sanctions. Not only so, it's also a story about coalitions. Here we see that Jehoram asked another nation to join him. And today when we listen to the news, we see nations aligning themselves with one another in coalitions to enter into the enterprise of war, one set against the other. That's what we see in this story. Now, what you're yet to see is that because they went through the territory of Edom, it was not just Jehoram and Jehoshaphat and their armies. They also enlisted the king of Edom and his army. So there were three armies going against the king of Moab. Now, we've seen the root cause of this war. There was no attack. It was just that one nation decided not to comply with the sanctions that had been imposed on it by another. In fact, perhaps the king of Moab perceived a weakness in this new king of Israel, Jehoram, and so he decided that it was time for him to rebel. So apparently Jehoram was personally offended by this, or perhaps there was some financial loss to himself or his kingdom without this massive amount of wool and these other lambs that he'd been shorted. So he decides to go to war. He decides to take men into battle and to risk their lives over wool, over money, or perhaps over nothing more than some principle that he felt had been offended, or some personal offense that he had. Not only so, not feeling that his own army was equipped to fight in the battle, he enlisted 2 other kings and their armies. So this is quite a significant undertaking. 3 kings, 3 armies going against the king of Moab. Now here's the question. Did he pray about it? No. Was he interested in God's will or God's directions? No. This was his decision. This was plans of his own making. And as always, he was in charge of his own army. So here's the first thing that we see, and the first point in your outline tonight is a poor leader fails to pray and fails to plan. Jehoram did not pray. He did not plan. Now the king of Edom is unnamed in this story. We don't know what his name was, but the king of Judah was a man named Jehoshaphat. He was a good king. He was a godly king. But one of the things that we can pick up on about Jehoshaphat is that maybe he was just a little bit naive, because he'd already been coerced by Jehoram's grandfather to go into battle with him on one occasion, and it was a situation in which it almost turned out to be a disaster. This too was a disaster in the making. It was not apparent at the moment, but as the days wore on in their circuitous march toward Moab, they would soon find themselves, these 3 kings and their armies, they would soon find themselves in desperate need. So we come to verse 9. So the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and they made a circuit of 7 days' journey, and there was no water for the army or the cattle that followed them. Now we've already asked the question, did Jehoram pray? And we've established that he did not pray. He never prayed, at least not to the God of heaven. The second question we need to ask, and we've already answered, is did he plan? He had the king of Edom with him, but apparently they didn't plan this out very well. Apparently the king of Edom didn't know his own territory. Would he not have been aware of the fact that there was not going to be water on this journey? And now there were 3 armies and 3 kings and enough cattle to sustain them for battle, but not a single drop of water. How had they come to such a moment? They came to that moment because Jehoram, as a leader, didn't pray. Jehoram didn't plan. And as a result, he found himself in desperate need. And he placed 3 armies of men in desperate need and great risk. Sometimes a leader who makes a bad decision in the beginning knows what to do to correct the course. I'm reminded about how Jehoshaphat himself, in a period of desperation, once called on God and said, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. But not Jehoram. There was not an ounce of prayer in him or an ounce of faith. But then look at verse 10. Then the king of Israel said, alas, for the Lord has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. Jehoram, as a leader, was overcome with a sense of doom. Imagine if you were a soldier in his army. Imagine if you were a citizen of his nation. Imagine if you were a deacon in his church and the man that was leading you had no faith in God, and Jehoram had none. He didn't have the faith to pray, he didn't have the faith to plan, and he didn't have the faith that God could get them out of this situation. But in this story we have the tale of 2 kings. There are 3, but really this story is a study in contrast between Jehoram, the king of Israel, on the one hand, and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, on the other. What does a man of faith do, a person of faith do, in a season of desperation? Does he allow himself to be overcome with a sense of doom? No. Consider Jehoshaphat's response to the crisis. Verse 11. Jehoshaphat said, is there not a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? And one of the king of Israel's servants answered and said, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. Jehoshaphat said, The word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat went, and the king of Edom went down to him. They went down to Elisha. So here we see what a good leader does in a moment of desperation. We said a bad leader doesn't pray and a bad leader doesn't plan, but a good leader, on the other hand, inquires of the Lord. A moment of despair is not a moment to wring one's hand. It's a moment to pray. It's a moment to hear from God. And in the mind of Jehoshaphat, there was no better way to hear from God and to receive his guidance than through one of God's prophets. And he knew this prophet Elisha. He knew him to be a man of God, and he knew that through him they would receive a word from God. I want to ask you a question. What kind of leader do we need in the midst of this present crisis in our world? What kind of leader do we need in the White House? What kind of leaders do we need in God's house? And what kind of leader do you need in your house? You need a leader who wants to know the heart and mind of God more than anything else. Consider this moment of interplay between Elisha and Jehoram in verse 13 of 2 Kings chapter 3. Now Elisha said to the king of Israel, "What do I have to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." And the king of Israel said to him, "No, for the Lord has called these 3 kings together to give them into the hand of Moab." That was his despair. That was his sense of doom. Elisha said, "As the Lord of hosts, before whom I stand, were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not look at you or see you." In other words, he had no regard at all for Jehoram. And Jehoram, here he was as a king, a leader of his people. He had no hope. He had no hope in the false gods of his father. But he also felt he had no hope in the God of heaven. He repeated his dismay in the presence of Elisha. "The Lord has called these 3 kings together to give them into the hand of Moab. We're doomed. We're sunk. It's over." Here's the next characteristic of a poor leader. A poor leader gives in to a sense of doom and hopelessness. Now, Elisha felt no pity for this man who had no passion for God. The only reason Elisha was willing to get involved at all was because of the godly king Jehoshaphat. I want to ask you, what kind of situation do you find yourself in as you listen to this message tonight? Have your decisions made without God brought you to some desert place of despair in your life where you have no hope of deliverance? Are you there because you didn't pray and you didn't plan? Does a cloud of gloom hang over your head the way it hung over the head of Jehoram? What hope did these 3 kings have? Well, their only hope was that Elisha would give them a word from God in this desperate situation. And it was desperate. They needed God's wisdom and God's direction, and they needed the faith to obey it. Listen now to what Elisha said in verse 15. He said, "Bring me a minstrel," or "Bring the minister of music. Bring someone over here to sing. Let them sing a song. Let them sing a hymn. Let them sing a praise chorus." And it came about when the minstrel played that the hand of the Lord came upon him, came upon Elisha, and he said, "Thus says the Lord." Here's our message title: "Make this valley full of trenches. For thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain, yet that valley shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, both you and your cattle and your beasts. This is but a slight thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hands." Now I remind you of their circumstances. 3 armies of men and their cattle that needed to be supplied during the time of battle had marched for 7 days into the wilderness and found no water. They were at the end of themselves, and they were at the mercy of the Moabite army. It was hopeless because Jehoshaphat had the sense to inquire of the Lord through the prophet Elisha. They received this word from God. Now, on the one hand is Jehoram. He's a poor leader. He didn't pray. He didn't plan. He gave in to a sense of doom and hopelessness. And on the other hand, there's Jehoshaphat, who had the sense to inquire from God. And here's the next characteristic about Jehoshaphat. A good leader looks for a word from God in a time of desperation. You don't give in to doom and hopelessness. Rather, you look for a word from God. And what was their word from God? Through Elisha. Remember the message title? Fill this valley with trenches. Well, what kind of word is that? Well, your Bible might read, depending on the translation you have, fill the valley or make the valley full of ditches. Well, what use was it? What purpose was it? Well, it was part of their preparation for the blessing of God that was to come upon them. Provision from God was coming, but they needed to act in anticipation of God's promise. They were to dig those trenches as an act of faith. Why? Because water was about to flow through that valley by an act of God. There were no clouds in the sky. There was no breeze that gave promise of a change in the weather. They weren't to watch the clouds. They were to listen to the heavens. And the word from the heavens was, fill the valley with trenches. Every man in every army, by all means necessary, must dig in spite of his thirst, and yet because of his thirst, they must dig to the point of exhaustion until the valley was filled with trenches. Why? Because God was about to do something. They didn't know what. They didn't know why. They didn't know how. All they knew is that their command from heaven was to fill the valley with trenches. Water was coming, but there was no sign of it. But there was a promise from God, and they were to act in anticipation of the fulfillment of their promise. They were to expect God to act. And their promise, their word from God was, fill the valley with trenches. Now, a poor leader, Jehoram, on the one hand, is the poor leader. Jehoshaphat is the good leader. A poor leader sees no hope in God's promise. How do you think Jehoram responded in his heart to his word from God? He'd already given up in doom and hopelessness. He saw no hope in God's promise because he saw no hope in God. So how does this word from the Lord apply to you in your desperation, or me in mine? What is God saying to us amidst circumstances that would leave us like Jehoram, wringing our hands in despair and throwing up our hands in defeat? Here it is. The thing that seems hard for you, that has you at your wit's end, that has you singing lamentations of hopelessness, is but a slight thing for the Lord. Your problem is not a problem to God. He can handle it. He can solve it. But you must dig your ditch in anticipation of his answer. You must move from desperate in the face of your circumstances to desperate preparation in anticipation of God's promise. Fill this valley with trenches. God has a plan to meet your need. Fill this valley with trenches. The blessing is coming. Act with faith that is as passionate in anticipation as you are desperate in your need. The last characteristic here, contrasting Jehoram on the one hand, Jehoshaphat on the other, is that a good leader acts in faith, expecting the fulfillment of God's promise. Now, what were these ditches, these trenches to do? Well, they were to hold water. Water was about to flow. Water was about to rush through that valley from heaven, and they needed ditches to contain it. Without these trenches, it would be lost as suddenly as it came. As they acted in obedience to God, he would, in response to their obedience, work not only the satisfaction of their thirst, but work their deliverance from the Moabite army. So we read verse 20. It happened in the morning, about the time of the offering of the sacrifice, that behold, water came by the way of Edom, and the country was filled with water. It was as God had promised. It will always be as God has promised. and we should always act in faith, believing God's promise. So what happened as a result of their action? We pick up in verse 21. Now all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. They heard that. The Moabites did. 3 kings and their armies have come to fight against us. And all who were able to put on armor and older were summoned and stood on the border. They rose early in the morning, early that morning when the water came through and filled the valley with water, and the trenches were full of water, and the armies of Judah and the armies of Israel and the armies of Edom had been refreshed, and the sun shone on the water, and the Moabites saw the water opposite them, but they saw it as red as blood. Somehow the way the sun shined on the water, something about maybe the color of the soil in the water. Then they said, "This is blood. Those 3 kings down there have surely fought together, and they have slain one another. Now therefore, Moab, to the spoil." They rushed down there to get the loot that was left over from the battle. But when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites arose and struck the Moabites so that they fled before them, and they went forward into the land, slaughtering the Moabites. What is it we see here? God not only provided water for their refreshment and salvation, God provided miraculous deliverance from their enemies. He provided all that they needed and more. As he had promised, this is but a slight thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand. So we read the story of what God can do when our circumstances are desperate, when your circumstances are desperate, when my circumstances are desperate, when our backs are against the wall, sometimes because we didn't pray and we didn't plan and we've led ourselves and others into great danger. The Bible shows us here that if we will inquire of the Lord and seek his direction and follow his plan, he will work mightily in our behalf. My word from God this week, in response to all that is happening in our church and around me, has been this: fill the valley with trenches. Act in faith. Act not because you believe I might do something, but act because you believe I will do something. This is not just my word from the Lord. It is your word from the Lord. Fill the valley with trenches. Expect something that only God can do. Thank you so much for listening.